Heretic is a new A24 horror film written and directed by Scott Beck and Brian Woods, who previously co-wrote A Quiet Place, wrote and directed the surprisingly fun 2019 horror Haunt, as well as the 2023 flop 65. So, a mixed bag. Heretic follows the story of two young, quite naive Mormon missionaries, Sister Barnes and Sister Paxton. We follow along as they attempt to spread the message of their church to various townsfolk, seemingly pretty unsuccessfully, before they eventually arrive to the home of Hugh Grant's character, Mr. Reed. After the usual scripted recruitment talk from the girls, they get invited in so they can take shelter from the storm, which they only accept as the seemingly friendly Mr. Reed assures them his wife is inside. A requirement for the girls as the Mormon church requires that female missionaries never be alone in the house with a man. Once inside, things take a bit of a turn, to say the least. It's clear that not everything is as it first seemed with Mr. Reed, and honestly, without spoiling the film completely, that's pretty much all I can say. The night proceeds with horrific consequences, as any good horror film should, but I'll leave the rest for you to see for yourself if you decide to give Heretic a watch. So, the question is, should you go watch it? In terms of the positives, Heretic is a unique concept for a horror, a really interesting plot which offers something a bit different from your run-of-the-mill slasher or haunted house horror schlock. It also provides a captivating performance from Hugh Grant, who's as charming as ever.
This is terribly awkward, but I wanted to tell you something, but I seem to be so charmingly befuddled.
As far as I can tell, this is only Grant's third horror film after 1988's The Lair of the White Worm and 1993's Night Train to Venice, both of which were box office flops, so it'll be interesting to see if he can break this pattern with Heretic. In addition to Grant, we also get two pretty engaging performances from Sophie Thatcher and Chloe East, our two protagonists. They're likeable enough to root for, which I honestly find surprisingly rare in horror films, and Heretic does a really good job of not relying on the stale trope of every character only falling victim due to their absolutely awful decision making and inability to run more than 2 meters without falling over. East and Thatcher also successfully convey their characters' deep-seated terror throughout, but which they also try to hide via a constructed mask of stoic composure as they attempt to stay strong and make it through the night. It's really quite well done. A somewhat strange positive is that the monologues delivered by Grant include all sorts of fascinating trivia you wouldn't expect to glean from any film, let alone a horror, and the monologues themselves are probably the highlight of the film as a result of both their content and their delivery. There are also some neat directorial choices, such as beginning the film with a series of expansive wide shots showing off the fantastic Canadian landscapes on display, before narrowing the characters and the audience's focus to something far more claustrophobic once our protagonists have entered the house where the rest of the film takes place. There's also one tracking shot in particular which forces a radical perspective change. You'll know the shot I'm talking about when you see it, which is really great, as well as the choice of Hugh Grant's clothing, which to me looks like he's wearing a modern version of Joseph's coat of many colours from the Old Testament story, which, given the subject matter, is a really nice touch. The first negative to speak of for Heretic is actually more of a potential negative, as it really depends on the individual. As the title implies, the story focuses heavily on religion. In fact, it's really the film's only focus. And, well, let's just say it's not a particularly positive one. Again, without going too in-depth on the details, all I can say is that individuals with more religious sensibilities, particularly Mormonism or Christianity in general, may be less likely to enjoy this film. But if you're the type of person who is irked by early 2010s online atheist rhetoric, or if you're not a fan of Family Guy-style potshots at religion...
Joseph Smith, discovering the Book of Mormon.
Oh, an old Con Ed bill. I mean, a New Testament of Jesus Christ, everyone has to sleep with me.
What?
And no dancing!
Then I'm just offering fair warning that Heretic probably isn't for you. A related issue with Heretic is that, although I'm not particularly religious myself, I felt that the onslaught of attacks against religion almost without reply was really heavy-handed. A story like this really needed more balance. In part, it really did feel like the writers had just spent a week binge-watching Family Guy and South Park episodes that shit on religion and decided to recreate them as a horror film.
What the Lord has to give us. He did so because we could not control our temptations.
Kinda like a priest in a room full of naked boys.
Again, this is not going to be everyone's cup of tea. In terms of the film sans any discussion of religion, it's a very slow burn of a movie. Although I still enjoyed it, the first act takes a while to really get going, which again might not be to everyone's taste. Although that being said, the first 2 acts of the film are definitely the strongest, with Act 2 being genuinely tense, intriguing, and showcasing the best of the acting amongst the cast. Unfortunately, things begin to fall apart in Act 3. While it's still interesting enough to be enjoyable, the radical change in pacing alongside an even more radical change in character development, and I use that term very loosely in Act 3, for one of our trio, just really took me out of the story. The plot gets a little zany, and there are several directorial problems wherein plot lines are either hinted at and just not followed through on, or else the directors are just flat out spamming the audience with red herrings that are never going to go anywhere. It's a shame because Heretic really does seem to have its act together up until the final third, when it stops being a careful, slow-paced psychological horror, and instead just starts throwing stuff at the wall until something sticks. We're going to finish off these reviews with some quick ratings of each important aspect of the film, including plot, world building, dialogue, characters, acting, direction, and finally, genre-specific elements. Note that since it's basically impossible to compare films from radically different genres, say teen rom-coms versus gritty gangster films, the ratings that follow essentially reflect ratings made within the standards set by the genre, and so a complex sci-fi plot may score the same as a really fun rom-com plot, because each may have accomplished its own goals successfully, even if the sci-fi plot is infinitely more complex. Now, onto the ratings. First, plot. Given its quite unique story, as well as its relatively novel subject matter and scope, Heretic offers a plot to me that's just way more interesting than your standard slasher or possession story, although it is of course not without its faults. 7.3 out of 10. Second, world building. I think Beck and Woods really missed the trick here. The story for Heretic has such potential for lore building. Throughout the film I was constantly assessing small details as the sets and scenes are filled with them, but in the end none of it really seemed to matter. It's a real shame. 5 out of 10. Next, dialogue. Although, as stated, Grant's monologues are probably the highlight of the film, there was a disappointing lack of retort from our two missionaries, and so the conversations always felt one-sided. Still, despite its lopsidedness, the dialogue was for the most part sharp and interesting. 7 out of 10. Next, characters. This is a difficult one to score as the performances from the actors are so good that we initially wanted to offer a much higher grade. But after thinking about it a bit longer, it's clear that the characters really lack depth. Without going into spoilers, in addition to issues with certain characters' motivations, there are radical changes made to one character's intellect and personality from one scene to the next purely because the plot demands it, which feels unearned and lazy. 5 out of 10. For acting, this is the strongest part of the film by far. While the dialogue is the highlight of the writing, the actors go above and beyond to bring it to life. Hugh Grant is excellent, putting a dark, sadistic twist underneath his usual charm, while Thatcher and East are compellingly terrified, as well as likeable, which I do think is rare for the genre. Fair play to everyone involved. Except for Topher Grace, whom I think is a fantastic comedic actor, but who has absolutely no business being in this film. I've honestly no idea why he's taken such a small, pointless role. It's really quite jarring. Other than that, the acting is great. 8.5 out of 10. In terms of direction, this is a difficult one. As stated earlier, some of the shots are fantastic, and the switch up from expansive wide shots in the opening to claustrophobic close-ups as the story progresses is a great decision. But there are issues. Mainly that so many threads are dangled out for the audience to reach for in hopes of twists, turns, or lore building, but most if not all unravel to reveal nothing at the end. 7 out of 10. Finally, the genre-specific elements of horror and thriller. Heretic is a tense, interesting, intriguing, and at least sometimes thrilling movie. Overall, if you don't mind the slow pace and the barbs at organised religion and are looking for something to watch this Halloween season, this might be the horror for you. 8 out of 10. Overall, Heretic's score could have been much higher. A score based on Acts 1 and 2 probably would have scored closer to 8 or even 8.5 out of 10. But since the third act really lets it down, it ends with a total score of 6.83. Still one of the more interesting horrors you're likely to see anytime soon, and one I'd recommend if you're a fan of slow burn horror films. If you like this video in any way, shape or form, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment, and all that good stuff. See you in the next video. Ta-ra.